You're listening to Audiology. Support our work on Patreon and be sure to submit your requests for topics in the comments below. Introduction. The Kasserine Pass battle occurred between February 18th and 24th, 1943, during the larger Tunisian campaign of World War II. The battle site was at a strategic natural passage in Tunisia's Atlas Mountains known as the Kasserine Pass. The confrontation was notable for being the first significant clash between American and Axis forces on African soil. The Axis contingent, under the command of General Erwin Rommel, consisted of the Afrika Korps Assault Group, the Italian Centauro Armored Division, and additional elements from the 5th Panzer Army. On the other side, the Allies had US 2 Corps, led by Major General Lloyd Fredendall, the British 6th Armored Division, under the command of Major General Charles Keightley, and other units aligned with Lieutenant General Kenneth Anderson's 1st Army. The American troops, green and poorly commanded at the outset, took heavy casualties and were driven back over 50 miles from their positions. Compounding the retreat, British troops also faced setbacks, including the loss of all of their tanks. However, Allied forces eventually checked the Axis advance with fresh reinforcements, robust artillery support, and regained control over the western Tunisian mountain passes, foiling the Axis's push. Although the Axis troops initially gained ground, they were eventually held back by Allied artillery and faced counterattacks and airstrikes, prompting their withdrawal by February 24th. The battle's aftermath led to criticism of Anderson, particularly for dispersing the 1st Armored Division's combat commands against the division commander's advice. The U.S. Army took this experience as a hard lesson, instigating major changes in their tactics, leadership, unit organization, and equipment to improve their fighting effectiveness in future engagements. Background. On November 8, 1942, American and British military units executed an amphibious assault along the coasts of French Morocco and Algeria as part of Operation Torch. This operation commenced shortly after the British 8th Army, under Lieutenant General Bernard Montgomery, made significant progress in the aftermath of the Second Battle of El Alamein. As a reaction to the Allied landings, German and Italian forces quickly fortified Tunisia by crossing from Sicily, which was a strategic location in North Africa owing to its defensible terrain and proximity to Sicilian bases, just a night away by sea. The short distance hindered the Allies from effectively intercepting Axis forces at sea, and air attacks were similarly challenging because the closest Allied airbase in Malta was over 200 miles from Tunisia. The campaign to swiftly seize Tunis before additional Axis reinforcements could strengthen its defenses was known as the Run for Tunis, and it occurred during November and December 1942. The challenge for the Allies was that only a small force could be supported through the limited regional transportation network, and the naturally strong defensive features of the area meant few Axis troops could effectively hold off this Allied advance. Nevertheless, the Allies gradually increased their presence and established additional airfields in eastern Algeria and Tunisia, which helped curb the flow of Axis reinforcements to Tunis and Bizerta. Even so, by this time, the Axis had already managed to deploy a substantial number of soldiers and resources. By January 23, 1943, the Allied forces, led by the 8th Army, had captured Tripoli, which had been a critical supply hub for Erwin Rommel. Predicting this development, Rommel had already shifted his supply chain to Tunis, aiming to defend Tunisia's southern approach from Tripoli at Gabes. There, he utilized the Marath Line, a series of outdated French fortifications inadequate for contemporary combat. Despite the outdated defenses of the Marath Line, Allied forces had made advances across the Atlas Mountains, establishing a forward base at Faid in a strategically advantageous position. From here, they were well placed to advance eastward toward the coast, potentially dividing the Axis forces in southern Tunisia from those in the north and severing the supply line to Tunis. Faid Pass. Units from the 5th Panzer Army, led by General Hans-Jürgen von Arnim, arrived at the eastern base of the Atlas Mountains held by Allied forces on January 30th. The German 21st Panzer Division encountered French forces at Faid. Despite the effective firing of the French 75mm guns, which inflicted significant losses on the Germans, the French defenses were rapidly overwhelmed. American artillery and the 1st Armored Division's tanks joined the fray, destroying some German tanks and seemingly sending the others into a frantic withdrawal. However, this retreat was a ruse. As the 1st Armored Division pursued, they were ambushed by hidden German anti-tank guns and took substantial losses. An American forward artillery observer lamented the destruction of the U.S. tanks, powerless to stop the onslaught of the German 88mm guns that devastated the advancing tanks. The 21st Panzer Division then pushed forward towards Faid once more. The situation worsened for the American infantry because of their inadequate shallow defensive positions, which allowed German tanks to crush the soldiers by simply driving over them. The 1st Armored Division's efforts to halt the German progression failed, as every defensive stance they attempted to hold had been captured, leading to further heavy losses from ensuing German attacks. On February 2nd, the 1st Armored Division received orders to halt their offensives and consolidate into a reserve force. Consequently, the Germans took control of most of Tunisia and blocked the passageways to the coastal plains. Although the Allies held the inner area of the Atlas mountain range, which was shaped more or less like a triangle, this position offered little strategic benefit because the exits were sealed by the enemy. Over the following 2 weeks, Rommel and other Axis leaders to the north debated on their next course of action. Sidi Bouzid. Rommel didn't see the British Eighth Army as a significant threat initially because they could only keep a limited number of troops in southern Tunisia until Tripoli's port was fully functional. The port started operations on February 9th, but wasn't entirely active until the end of that month. In early February, Rommel suggested to the Italian High Command in Rome that he attack with 2 task forces, which would include parts of the 5th Panzer Army, targeting American supply bases in western Algeria. Rommel anticipated that a swift assault could seize these supplies and impede American forces from massing near Tebessa. However, Arnhem disagreed, resulting in a week's delay before they agreed to launch Operation Frühlingswind, a push by the 5th Panzer Army into the American communication and supply hub of Sidi Bouzid. Meanwhile, Rommel, positioned 60 miles to the southwest, would commence Operation Morgenluft, aiming to take Gafsa and move toward Tozeur. The 10th and 21st Panzer Divisions initiated the Battle of Sidi Bouzid on February 14th, located about 10 miles west of Faid in the plain of the Atlas Mountains. American tanks were defeated, and their infantry units were left isolated, unable to support each other on 3 separate hills. An attempted counterattack on the following day failed, and by February 16th, the Germans were progressing toward Spatla. After the win at Sidi Bouzid, Rommel directed the Afrika Korps assault group to strike Gafsa on February 15th. But the night before, Anderson had ordered the defending troops to pull back to a more defensible position around the hills of Feriana, conceding Gafsa in anticipation of a substantial enemy offensive. Given the danger to the southern flank, Anderson received approval from Eisenhower to withdraw from the eastern dorsal to the western dorsal, starting from Feriana. On the morning of February 17th, Fredendall instructed a retreat from Spitla and Feriana. This allowed the U.S. II Corps to regroup at the Kasserine and Spiba passes along the western extent of the mountains. American losses in these series of engagements included 2,546 personnel, with additional losses of 103 tanks, 280 vehicles, 18 field guns, 3 anti-tank guns, and 1 anti-aircraft battery. Axis plan of attack. During a period of strategic discussion within the Axis ranks regarding their next move, they held control over the entirety of Tunisia and were in a holding pattern pending the arrival of the Eighth Army at Mareth. Rommel put forward a strategy to take advantage of the situation by launching an offensive through Kasserine Pass to engage the main elements of the U.S. II Corps stationed at Tebessa. His goal was to seize American supplies located on the Algerian side across the western mountain range, hinder Allied attacks along the coastal route between Mareth and Tunis, and pose a threat to the southern wing of the First Army. On February 18th, Rommel presented his plan to Albert Kesselring, who endorsed it and duly passed it along to the Italian High Command in Rome. The following day, at 1:30 in the afternoon, Rommel was given the green light from the Italian High Command for a modified version of his plan. He would be reinforced with the 10th and 21st Panzer Divisions, which were previously under the 5th Panzer Army led by Arnhem, and was instructed to progress through both the Kasserine and Spiba passes towards Thala and Lake Hef in the north. This action was meant to clear the western dorsal, an elevated ridge in Tunisia, and put pressure on the First Army's flank. However, Rommel was critical of this amended plan, as it scattered the Axis forces and made them vulnerable by exposing their flanks during the passes. He believed a more concentrated assault on Tebessa came with some risk, but had the potential to draw in much-needed resources, incapacitate Allied capabilities for launching operations into central Tunisia, and seize control of the Yeux-les-Bains airfield, which was to the west of Tebessa. Battle at Sheba. During the early morning of February 19th, Rommel ordered an offensive through the Kasserine Pass, directing the Afrika Korps assault group based in Feriana to lead the charge. He also commanded the 21st Panzer Division positioned at Spitla to advance north through an eastern corridor of Kasserine towards Spiba and Xur. Concurrently, he arranged for the Kampfgruppe von Broich, a detachment from the 10th Panzer Division freed by Arnhem, to gather at Spitla, poised to capitalize on any opportunity arising from the offensive through either pass. Battle groups. Stenkopf and Schutte, which consisted of what remained of the 21st Panzer Division, commenced an offensive in the Spiba region. However, the German advance was met by significant opposition, including the British 6th Armored Division, though largely without the 26th Armored Brigade, barring tanks from the 16th Lancers, which had been redeployed to Thala. Additional Allied forces confronting the Germans consisted of the U.S. 18th Regimental Combat Team from the 1st Infantry Division, several battalions from the U.S. 34th Infantry Division, artillery units from the U.S., 2 British anti-tank regiments, and some French contingents. The defensive Allies had strengthened their positions with minefields and by delivering substantial firepower. This formidable defense impeded the German forces' progress. The 21st Panzer Division, in particular, was not only halted but also subsequently forced to retreat on February 20th. Kasserine Pass. A defensive group was stationed at the pass, including the U.S. 1st Battalion from the 26th RCT, the 19th Combat Engineer Regiment, the 6th Field Artillery Battalion, a tank destroyer unit, along with a French artillery unit. Nearby to the west, French General Welvert led a mix of U.S. and French forces, including a Ranger and Infantry Battalion, 3 French Infantry Battalions, artillery units, and some additional support units, collectively known as Task Force Welvert. Further west, Task Force Bowen, composed of the 3rd Battalion of the 26th RCT, was positioned to block access from Feriana to Tebessa. The 1st Armored Division, though partially incapacitated, was reorganizing to the north. On the night of February 18th, Colonel Alexander Stark was appointed the head of the positions within the pass, leading the newly named Stark Force. In response, the 33rd Reconnaissance Unit's surprise attack on the Kasserine defenses was thwarted, leading to an attack on the pass by both German and Italian forces that progressed slowly against firm artillery resistance. Rommel scheduled a more forceful attack with coordinated divisions for the following morning. Meanwhile, British forces were amassing, and though their participation was limited, several groups were formed to intervene, including Gore Force and Nick Force. Overnight, American defensive positions on the high ground around the pass were taken over. The Axis forces continued their assault the next morning, overpowering the defenders. Stark Force was on the brink of collapse, prompting Gore Force to be dispatched to help near Thala, while the Axis forces pushed forward their assault towards Tebessa. The Axis onslaught eventually broke through, causing one of the worst defeats for the U.S. forces in the Tunisian campaign. The Italian 5th Bersaglieri Regiment was particularly noted for its critical role in the success, even losing their commander, Colonel Bonfatti, during their offensive. By midday, additional German panzer battalions had engaged and pushed back the defenders. The Axis armored units charged through the pass, forcing a disorganized U.S. retreat. Those U.S. forces that remained were pushed further back towards Jebel el Hamra, where more U.S. armored units were arriving. Simultaneously, Gore Force, fighting a retreating battle, lost all of its tanks and eventually fell back to rejoin with a larger British armored formation some miles away. Fighting at Jebel el Hamra. On the afternoon of February 21st, the German-Italian Africa Corps attack group commenced its move towards Hydra and Tebessa by way of the Hatab River Valley. Their progress was stopped upon encountering defensive positions held by the U.S. 16th Infantry Regiment of the 1st Infantry Division and Combat Command B of the 1st Armored Division at Jebel el Hamra. Although subject to intense combat and airstrikes, the German-Italian forces were unable to push back the U.S. forces. With the enemy's advance toward Tebessa thwarted, American generals Paul Robinette and Terry Allen began preparing for a counteroffensive set for February 22nd. However, the battle impacted both sides' strategies, and the Axis troops, which included the 5th Bersaglieri, a Semovente unit from the Centauro Division, and the 15th Panzer Division, initiated a new attack that morning towards Buchepka Pass. Despite being under significant pressure, the American lines held strong. By the afternoon, the U.S. infantry and armored forces countered vigorously, overwhelming the German-Italian troops. The successful counteroffensive resulted in the capture of more than 400 Axis soldiers and pushed back against the positions held by the Africa Corps. Maneuvers at Thala. Rommel had positioned himself along with the primary force of the 10th Panzer Division on the path to Thala, where the British 26th Armored Brigade and surviving American forces from the 26th Infantry Regiment were entrenched on the hilltops. The strategic importance of Thala was that if it were to be captured, one of the two key roads leading from there to Tebessa would be severed, isolating the U.S. 9th Infantry Division further north and entrapping Combat Command B from the 1st Armored Division between the 10th Panzer Division and its advancing Allied units. This significant group met stiff resistance at Thala and engaged in a grueling defensive action, methodically retreating from one ridgeline to the next. By nightfall, they managed to halt the German advance just outside the town. Artillery reinforcement from the 9th Infantry Division, which had impressively traveled 800 miles from Morocco since February 17th, joined the defense efforts that night, setting up their 48 guns alongside anti-tank units. The following day saw the defensive line held chiefly by British forces, who were now backed by a formidable assembly of British and American artillery, organized under the command of Brigadier General Stafford Leroy Irwin. The artillery support included 36 British guns and was complemented by armored vehicles from the Derbyshire Yeomanry, as well as Valentine and Crusader tanks provided by the 17th 21st Lancers. Despite receiving orders to proceed to Le Kef in anticipation of another potential German assault, the 9th Infantry Division's artillery was convinced by Major General Ernest N. Harmon, dispatched by Eisenhower for battle assessment, to remain in position. On February 22nd, in the early hours, the Allies unleashed a powerful artillery strike against the 10th Panzer Division, inflicting heavy damage on German armor and equipment and disrupting their communication lines. This forced the German commander Broich to halt his forces to reorganize. Even as the 10th Panzer Division was reeling under this firepower, additional Allied reinforcements were arriving. Exposed to continuous Allied bombardment, the 10th Panzer Division eventually withdrew under the cover of darkness, marking their exit from the battlefield. Withdrawal. Struggling with depleted resources and under relentless pressure from Allied forces in the Thala Pass, as well as facing U.S. counteroffensive maneuvers near the Hatab River, Field Marshal Erwin Rommel recognized that his forces had reached their limit. The combined German and Italian troops had been unable to secure a decisive victory and break through the Allied defenses at Spiba, by the Hatab River, and at Thala. Seeing little chance for further gains, Rommel decided it would be better to regroup in southern Tunisia to launch an unexpected strike against the British Eighth Army before it could fully prepare. Despite these setbacks, Rommel took some comfort in the knowledge that his campaign had inflicted significant losses on the Allies and had destroyed their positions in the Gafsa-Spitla zone. During a strategy session at Rommel's headquarters in Kasserine on February 23rd, Albert Kesselring and Siegfried Westphal attempted to persuade Rommel to reconsider his plan, suggesting that victory was still within reach. However, Rommel stood firm in his decision, and Kesselring eventually yielded. Later that evening, the Italian High Command in Rome issued commands to abort the offensive, instructing all Axis forces to withdraw to their original locations. Compounding the Axis forces' troubles, a large-scale American air assault on the pass expedited their retreat. By the end of February 24th, the Allied forces had retaken control of the pass. Feriana was under Allied command, and shortly thereafter, Sidi Bouzid and Spatla were also recaptured. Casualties and losses. During the Kasserine conflict, the German forces suffered 989 casualties, consisting of 201 deaths, 536 injuries, and 252 soldiers unaccounted for. They also sustained material losses, which included 20 tanks, 67 various vehicles, and 14 artillery pieces. On the other hand, the Allies took 608 Axis soldiers as prisoners, with 73 being German and 535 Italian. The American forces experienced significant losses, with 300 soldiers killed, 3,000 wounded, and 3,000 reported missing. The high number of casualties necessitated an influx of 7,000 additional soldiers to bring the units back to their initial strength. Within the French 34th Division, there were 50 fatalities, 200 injuries, and 250 soldiers missing. Furthermore, German generals Rommel and Ziegler reported capturing 3,721 Allied prisoners, a figure later revised to 4,026 in a report dated February 24th. Material losses sustained by the U.S. II Corps were quite substantial and included 183 tanks, 104 half-tracks, 208 artillery pieces, and 512 trucks and vehicles, with some falling into German hands. The Allied forces also lost significant amounts of supplies, with the Germans seizing over 215 cubic meters, approximately 57,000 U.S. gallons, of gasoline and lubricants, as well as 45 tons of ammunition. Rommel after the battle. Rommel had aspirations to capitalize on the Allied commander's lack of experience, but faced resistance from Arnhem, who chose to ignore Kesselring's directive and did not commit a significant tank detachment from the 10th Panzer Division, preferring to save resources in his area. Rommel observed that American forces had initially displayed their inexperience, neglecting the strategic context of the battles. However, Rommel also recognized and admired the swift adaptation and competence in mobile warfare the U.S. commanders developed, alongside their effective use of well-adapted British tactics in American-made equipment. The Germans were especially impressed with the robust design of the American M3 armored half-track, which they subsequently used extensively after capturing a number of them. The Allies, for their part, conducted serious analyses of their tactical shortcomings. U.S. troops, often placed by leaders who hadn't surveyed the terrain themselves, were dispersed too widely for effective mutual support. American soldiers had developed a tendency to neglect thorough entrenching practices, revealing their locations, clustering in groups within view of German artillery spotters, and setting up positions along ridges that made them easily visible against the skyline and consequently easier targets. A notable issue was the shallow entrenchments soldiers dug as a result of frustration with the tough Tunisian terrain, when deeper foxholes were needed. The U.S. 1st Armored Division was particularly unprepared for German anti-tank strategies and screening maneuvers, a knowledge gap that could have been filled by learning from the experienced British armor units. However, many in the U.S. Army did acknowledge the presence of German deception operations. Moreover, the Allies failed to maintain air dominance, which not only facilitated German air attacks, but also hampered Allied intelligence gathering and coordination efforts, often nullifying U.S. defensive artillery configurations through aggressive close air support from the Luftwaffe. Eisenhower after the battle. General Dwight D. Eisenhower overhauled the command structure of the Allied forces by setting up the 18th Army Group under the leadership of General Sir Harold R.L.G. Alexander, with the aim to enhance the coordination and joint operations of the Allied forces from different countries. He dismissed Major General Lloyd Fredendall from his service and sent him back to the U.S. due to a loss of confidence in his leadership by his subordinates, as identified by Major General Omar Bradley and others. Eisenhower's observations echoed the sentiments expressed by Alexander, who doubted the quality of the leaders like Fredendall. The U.S. Army forces in North Africa were burdened with commanders who had been discredited following failures in combat and who were hesitant to adopt substantial changes in strategy. This situation resulted from training programs at home that had not adequately prepared these leaders. The blame for the lack of concentration of Allied armored forces fell largely on Fredendall, but also on First Army Commander Anderson, whose failure to unify and maintain cohesive forces led to their eventual breakdown into isolated units. Anderson further neglected a critical request for support from the beleaguered French 19th Corps, which Fredendall had refused to acknowledge responsibility for. Anderson's controversial decision to scatter the combat commands of the U.S. 1st Armored Division against Major General Orlando Ward's recommendations was another strategic error. Both U.S. Brigadier General Irwin and British Brigadier Nicholson, despite earlier troubles, went on to achieve higher commands in Europe and India, respectively. Enhancements in command protocol encouraged Allied leaders to more actively lead and maintain closer positions to the front lines, departing from Fredendall's less hands-on approach. Meanwhile, General George Patton took over command of the II Corps, known for his decisiveness and willingness to act independently without waiting for approval. Initially removed to assist in planning the Sicilian invasion, Patton was later replaced by Bradley as Assistant Corps Commander when he returned to planning. Further orders from Alexander to Patton for the advancement from Gafsa were ignored by Patton when he deemed them too restrictive or inappropriate given the changing tactical situation. Additionally, steps were taken to better integrate artillery and air support, which saw significant improvements in artillery response times. However, fully coordinated close air support would not be realized until Operation Overlord. The U.S. anti-aircraft artillery underwent reforms after recognizing the limitations of their existing firepower and the need for dedicated anti-aircraft guns to defend against aerial assaults. This awareness came after realizing that field units, including one division where 95% of air attacks targeted their artillery, required better protection from enemy aircraft, which were susceptible to vehicle-mounted .50 caliber rounds, but also needed specialized anti-aircraft weapons for effective defense.